Good morning. It's very early, and I'm quite certain that none of you were in bed at your normal bedtime. So thank you for being here. I know there's going to be a lot of people filtering in throughout our session, but thank you for being here bright and early. So as she said, I'm Nicole Fisher. I'm a health policy advisor in DC, and I have the honor of moderating the first panel of the day, in which we're, no pressure. We're going to set the tone of talking about digital medicine and the future and where we're going, which is a wonderful way, I think, to actually start the day. So what I'm going to do to get everyone's voices going is I'm actually going to have you introduce yourselves. So Adam, I'm going to start with you. Tell everyone just a little bit about you and why you're here.
Sure. My name is Adam Brickman. I'm the Director of Strategic Communications and Public Policy at Omada Health. For those of you who don't know Omada, we work with employers, health plans, health systems to help identify and reduce risk for their populations most at risk for obesity-related chronic disease, so diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, etc. So my background is a mix of politics, policy, and communications, and I've been with Omada Health now for about 2.5 years, leading our communications team and our work with the federal government.
Perfect. Glen?
I'm Glen Vries. I'm the president and co-founder of Medidata Solutions. We connect about 800 life sciences companies, academic medical centers as well, a few 100,000 doctors and nurses, and about 3 million patients in research projects running all over the world. And actually one of the fastest growing things that's happening in those research projects is taking those patients and having them as digitally connected constituents in those research projects. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Naomi Freed. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you to the organizers. I am a digital health and innovation strategist. I lead my own firm, Health Innovation Strategies. Previously, I was the Vice President of Innovation and External Partnership at Biogen, where I developed their Innovation Beyond the Molecule strategy. Before that, I was the Chief Innovation Officer at Boston Children's Hospital, developing an innovation digital health accelerator for them. And prior to that, I was at Kaiser Permanente as their first Vice President of Innovation and Advanced Technology, looking at emerging trends in technology. And today, I'm very excited to be working with large providers and pharma and helping them think about what their digital health strategy should be in terms of partnering and working with startups and really taking advantage of all the innovation that we're starting to see in the industry.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Walter Greenleaf. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Paratherapeutics, and also I'm the medical virtual reality expert at the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. I'm excited to be here because my special area of focus has finally taken off in a big way. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist by training, research scientist. I've also had the pleasure of starting and having successful exits for 3 medical product companies. But my main focus over the last 30 years has been how virtual reality technology can be applied to medical applications. So as you can imagine, with the big surgence now of this technology at an affordable way and its importance for behavioral health care and wellness and other aspects of medical care, this is a very exciting year for me. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. You can imagine how exciting the conversations were leading up to this panel. I have so many questions. And like all good moderators, I wrote some of them down. But I actually want this to be really conversational. And I'll leave plenty of time at the end for you guys to ask questions and get involved. So I'm going to come back down to you, Adam. So, you and I are both in policy. It's a very interesting time to be a policy advisor, especially in the healthcare space and technology. It's kind of a wild west. But you could also say that about digital medicine, right? As we're starting to tease it out from digital health and the tools and the toys and all these things. So I just want to start at the beginning and ask to you, what is digital medicine?
No, it's a great question, and I think in the report that you and EBD Group put out right before this, like, you made a really important differentiation between sort of the broad digital health, yeah, I did my homework, and what digital medicine is. And there are a couple ways to describe it, and I think digital medicine, you could say it's a subset of digital health, you could say it's an evolution of digital health. To us, this year is really when digital health, and particularly digital medicine, or what we sometimes call digital therapeutics, is entering kind of the post-hype phase. It's been around for several years. I think the incumbents in the space know it's here to stay, and they're now beginning to understand how you differentiate what is truly digital medicine to what is, the toy versus the tool. And I think we think about it in 5 major categories. So if you're going to be considered digital medicine and really have those clinical applications, there are a couple things that are sort of table stakes at this point. I think number one is that your intervention or what you're doing in the space is based on an existing body of clinical evidence. So did you come up with something that has a basis of evidence? Number two, are you then publishing your outcome data to validate your own self in a clinical space? Number three, are you working to integrate into a clinical setting? So are you working with providers? Are you working with big health systems? It doesn't matter if you have the greatest intervention or greatest tool in the world. If it doesn't get into the hands of the people who need it, it doesn't matter. Number four is, are you leveraging the unique facets of digital, specifically data science, to start to personalize that? You know, we're talking a lot these days about precision medicine in genomics and cancer care. When it comes to behavioral interventions, it can be just as important. And then finally, are you creating a revenue structure that forces you to deliver outcomes? Are you operating on a system that is not pay per employee or pay per beneficiary per month, but actually holding your company's feet to the fire? So I think those 5 things in our mind really differentiate or define digital medicine as opposed to a sort of broader umbrella term like digital health.
Thank you.
I want to just sort of jump in and talk a little bit about another way of sort of thinking about digital health and digital medicine. And I think that the idea of sort of differentiating between sort of the health and wellness apps and the clinical apps is really valuable. And I think even looking more closely at the clinical apps, of which there are, and not just apps, but clinical solutions, of which there are many, there's an opportunity really within patient care to further divide and explain what the solutions are that are out there. So when I think about digital medicine for patient care, I think there's sort of 4 broad categories, all of which I think meet the criteria that you've been describing. And the way I like to think about them is in terms of what they do for the patient. So there is, the first category, in no particular order, is virtual care. So the ability to deliver care via telemedicine, via remote patient monitoring. American Well is a company that's sort of making a market in the activity of connecting patients and clinicians virtually. There's also the opportunity, the second category would be digital diagnosis. So we now have companies and tools that can diagnose conditions and diseases using digital solutions rather than the physician. I'm thinking of Empatica for epilepsy as an example, or ResDex that helps, well, that is proposing to diagnose pediatric pneumonia by listening to a child's cough. So we have virtual care, we have digital diagnosis. There's also medication adherence. I think this is a really important area for patient care, and there are a variety of companies, startups that are springing up in this area. PillDrill is one that recently got funding, but these are all the solutions around smart pill boxes and blister caps that are helping patients adhere. There's also companies like Propeller Health that provides a smart inhaler to determine when a patient's taken their asthma medication. And the last area, which is one that I think is the most exciting, and I think there's a couple companies presenting here today, is the digiceuticals, and these are digital therapies that actually treat a condition directly. So it could be Pear, it could be Gaia, which is presenting later today, which has a digital solution for depression. And I think what is really exciting about these companies is when they are going through and actually running the clinical trials, collecting the data, making sure there's reimbursement models, and really going forward to provide new ways of improving patient outcomes. And so I think that because there's so much activity in this area, having this substructure for patient care is really a helpful framework.
Thank you. So I want to come back to something you said and used a word that I liked, which was hype. But I'm going to pose the question to you. Okay. So I would argue that a lot of the failures that we've seen aren't surprises. But how do we make sure that digital medicine isn't hype, that we're actually moving things forward?
All right, so I will start by agreeing with you that we are in a hype cycle around digital medicine. I have certainly said, and others have, we're kind of in this age of snake oil in digital medicine. I think that's a little bit too mean because I don't think it has a lot of the malintent that term implies. But the fact of the matter is we can categorize things in every way and review what's going on. Everything in digital medicine, going back to the semantics of it, ends with the word medicine. And we need to treat it like that. And we also need to learn from the past. And what we know is that discovering new ways to diagnose and treat disease is non-trivial. And we should expect failures along the way. So actually kind of in the hype cycle earlier this year, I think one of the most interesting kind of randomized controlled trials in digital medicine, which Scripps did, which did not show any what I would call efficacy from a life sciences perspective of some of the app-based and device-based interventions, I think is to be hugely applauded. Right? It's the kind of thing that in the practice of science and medicine we use to figure out what to do differently in the next iteration of experimentation. And so I think that the most important thing in terms of controlling the hype cycle, or probably in the more positive way from an entrepreneurial perspective, riding the hype cycle to successes that will benefit patients and probably create a lot of economic benefit too, is to figure out how, whether it's in expectations from a regulatory perspective, which I think will be very interesting to discuss, or from an outcomes measurement perspective, if you're a provider, you're a patient, we start to play by consistent rules. And I'll just end by saying, I don't think we need to discover most of those rules. We've been using them in what is the modern life sciences industry for the last 70 years. We know how to evaluate whether an idea is one that's going to provide value to patients. We just now need to apply that discipline to what's coming out of this digital medicine explosion.
And Walter, I want to kind of build on that with you. So as someone, you've mentioned all these companies you've been involved with, things you've taken to market. So what are some of the tools that you see through your lens that'll help usher in this new era?
Well, first of all, I should mention I'm looking forward to the day where we don't say digital medicine. I think the term will disappear, and it will just be part of medicine and won't be a separate category. In terms of tools that are enabling us right now, well, there's obviously three really big ones coming from the tech sector. AI, deep analytics and analysis of data. And again, I'm a bit biased on this, but virtual reality technology, I think it's going to be a transformative technology, especially for behavioral medicine, that's really going to affect everything we do. So I see those three tech trends coming through. And frankly, I've had some friends saying that this new wave of technology from those three are really digital medicine 2.0, that we started out with some apps on our cell phones and websites, et cetera, but now we have some technology that goes a little bit deeper, is, in my opinion, a little bit more extremely profound, and it's going to be changing how we do things. So I think we've learned a lot from digital medicine 1.0, but I think things are lurching forward into a new era.
So with that, I'm going to pitch this out to all of you. What are the barriers? Because there have been a lot of lessons learned. And as Glen said, we should applaud the failures. They've gotten us here. They've gotten us to 2.0. But what are the barriers that still exist, those challenges that you guys are having to work through every day?
I'll two sort of jump to mind, and on the first one, I'm really curious about, Naomi, your perspective as well, because of the sort of big health systems you've worked with as a chief innovation officer. But I think one is sort of what I would describe as a healthy skepticism of adoption from some of the big incumbent players, whether they are health plans, whether they're health systems, what we call passing the medical director test, to be able to walk into those offices and make a strong clinical case, just as you would for some pharmaceutical intervention or something that did not have digital tack to the front of it. You need to be able to make as strong a case as possible. And that takes time and effort and doesn't necessarily line up with the business and hype cycle that a lot of companies get pulled into, where they're rushing to commercialization. I think number two, so Naomi, really interested in your perspective on that. Number two, and this is because it's top of mind with me, is on the policy side. I think you're seeing, medicine and healthcare is a highly regulated space for extremely good reasons. You're dealing with matters quite literally of life and death. But I think the pace at which this industry wants to move and largely has been moving often outstrips the ability of those who regulate it or make policy for it to keep up. Not necessarily that there are explicit barriers against, but that you're sometimes entering a space that doesn't fully exist yet. Now, I think I will give a shout out to the federal policymakers and regulators we've worked with, because they've wanted to learn and wanted to understand, and have been open to new ways of doing things. But it is a very, very distinct change in philosophy, change in thought process from agencies and regulators who have been doing things the same way for a very long time.
So a couple of responses. I think, ironically, one of the challenges in the industry right now is in some areas there's not enough barriers. It's really easy to go and build an app and get it out on a phone and say, hey, digital health, here you go. And I don't think that does the industry a great service, because a lot of these apps and solutions are not tested. There isn't the data behind it. There often isn't a business model, but then again, hey, they're just in the app store. So I think there's a lack of barriers on one side. But then I think we have a lot of very creative and interesting new solutions and things that are actually potentially disruptive innovation. And when you have disruptive innovation, you usually need a new ecosystem, potentially a new reimbursement, a new model. And so we see things like telehealth bumping up against existing regulations. So sort of, if you think about the remote delivery of care, there's still in a number of states rules that prevent doctors from having a virtual visit, talking with their patient if their patient lives in another state. So when I was at Boston Children's Hospital, we did a lot of transplants. Kids came into Boston to have their care, to have their surgery, and the follow-up was quite extensive after that. Now, in the ideal world, those kids could, after a couple months, go home and then just continue to have those appointments with their doctors virtually. Unfortunately, because of existing regulation and prohibitions against physicians practicing medicine across state line, if this patient went home to New York, the doctor in Boston could not actually care for them using virtual medicine. So I think what we're seeing is some challenges with applying existing regulations and rules to new models of care, and that we really need to work on changing the regulation. And what also goes along with that is the need for new reimbursement and thinking about things, again, like telehealth, remote patient monitoring, virtual care that's delivered. You know, there needs to be a way to pay for these wonderful new solutions that are improving access, potentially improving outcomes. And I'll tell you, the providers are struggling with this. They're struggling with the new models. They want to adopt them, but when the payers are not open or the regulations aren't in place that require payment for these new models, they get stuck very quickly. And then just to get back to the point you were making, I agree completely that if you're coming forward with a new solution to a provider, data is going to be critical. You have to be able to demonstrate the impact of the solution you're proposing. And I had a lot of innovators who came to me when I was at Boston Children's Hospital asking, how do I get Boston to use my great new solution? I said, you know what, you're going to have to prove to us that it actually works. You're going to need some data, and preferably data done at my institution. So if you want to partner with me, let's do a pilot, let's get a little data, and let's get an internal champion. And those two things, data and a champion within our organization, because everybody's busy, will do more than anything else to get your solution in and get you the attention that you need.
Just throw out business models and pricing of solutions as a barrier. And I think that's a very positive thing to have as a barrier, because it's going to create the opportunity for innovative thinking and creative ways to fix this problem. But a digital medicine tool in some of the categories, not all, I think is the same kind of tool in the way a medical device or a pharmaceutical pill is a tool that's in the kit of a healthcare provider. And in the case of those other two more traditional tools, the cost of development, the cost of getting this empirical backing that shows the value of it is priced into that tool itself. Yet the expectation in digital is everything is fast and free. And so the business models that go with internet chat are probably not going to be compatible with what you see in digital health. And there are going to be companies that are going to be hugely disruptive, but again, I look at the lessons of failure. For every Uber out there, there's probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of companies that tried to disrupt car services and failed on the way. So again, we have to think about how we're going to have that environment that still encourages and rewards the entrepreneurial, inventive spirit with sustainable business models. And I'm not sure that's been well defined or proven out yet.
I'd like to add one more log to the fire that everybody here has built. Which is sort of a blind spot that I think many of the technology developers have, and which is understanding the workflow of the clinical environment.
Yes.
And this is expanding a bit upon the point that Glen was making, is understanding the business model, but really understanding what happens at the clinic. How can we not interfere with that very frantic, very efficient business, which really is at a very delicate balance? And I think when I look at most of the medical startups up there, that's what they're missing, is really understanding how their technology maps to the existing workflow.
It was completely unplanned, but each one of you touched on something I want to get to. And I started panicking, like, well, how do I pick and choose? Who goes first? But I want to say, Naomi, you used the word proof. And I thought it really tied into what you said, because coming from the policy world, we have that same discussion, even around things like reimbursement. We need proof. We can't allocate funds for something. We can't give it to an agency and start regulating or understanding or setting boundaries until we have proof that something works or it doesn't work or understand the dynamics. And that's really difficult in this space so early on. So I just really wanted to highlight that. I think that's fantastic. So I want to I guess we'll go sort of that R&D. We'll start there because I think can lead into some of these other questions. So we're seeing trends, and one of those trends I've actually written about is that M&A activity is replacing or overshadowing at minimum R&D. And so in this space, can one or all of you talk a little bit about that trend and what's happening and why you think that's continuing? Walter, yeah, let's start with you.
Well, I think one reason I see, at least my perspective from Silicon Valley, is that there's not enough technical experts. So there's a lot of acqui-hires that companies will acquire another company, not because they need access to the engineers, to the programmers, and sometimes some of the enabling IP. And it's a faster way for people to get going. So that's why one of the vectors I see propelling the M&A activity.
I mean, I think this is also a trend that you can see in biological innovation, right? I mean, you're seeing large pharmaceutical companies trying to replace their own internal high-scale R&D spend with M&A as well. So I think there's probably something to be said about, again, just the economics of invention that are supported by strategies like that. So I think, going back to business models, it's not so much that the M&A replaces R&D, it's just a different model for where the R&D happens and where the dollars get spent.
Sure. So then talking about dollars, let's keep going down that path. How do we, and I'll take sort of the brunt of this coming from DC, how do we ensure, whether it's new models, new engagement, new data, how do we ensure that as we move or we try really hard or we claim, we're moving to a value-based system? How do we incentivize digital therapeutics or medicine or whichever word we want to use there in a way that actually gets us closer and closer to value?
So I'll take the first part of this, and I think this is something we thought about very early. And I was actually we were in a meeting yesterday with our CEO, and he sort of self-deprecatingly attributed this to naivete when he first came into the space, was to say, well, of course we're promising an outcome to our clients. We should only get paid if we accomplish that outcome. And by the way, if we accomplish that outcome, we are affecting cost savings of which we're capturing a small portion. So from a logical standpoint, that made a lot of sense to us early. When we went into the space to start operationalizing this, whether it was with employers or health plans, we, I think, underestimated how difficult it was going to be because of how unusual that revenue model will be. Now, I think in the 5 years we've been around, you've seen a lot of other companies start to move in this direction. You've started to see plans and employers kind of expect this. But operationalizing it, I think, is still really difficult because, often when we'll go in with a benefits director at a large employer, that person wants to be able to go to the C-suite and say, this is what it's going to cost this year. And they're very used to that formulation, even if they can't point to, say, a return on investment on that. So to come and say, it may cost this, it may cost that, but if it costs the higher number, we can actually model exactly what your return on investment is going to be because we've published on that So I think it is a combination of that first proof point, to have the literature behind you, and then be ready to do the hard work and go in there and operationalize it, and not underestimate what that takes.
So you mentioned humans. So let's talk about humans. At the end of the day, all the things we're talking about come down to people, whether it's the provider or the patient. And so I mentioned value, and what's at the center of that? The patient. And it's something that, especially in this space, we often talk around. So I'd like to just dig in a little about this keeping, how do you see, especially in the next few years, as we're growing exponentially in this space, how do you see keeping patients at the center of digital medicine?
So I actually think there's an element of value-based care that people don't think about digital medicine necessarily as part of, which it will benefit from in terms of driving it to be an important topic in broader medicine. Measuring value in virtually any type of therapy is something that I think it's a reasonable hypothesis to say can be done more effectively with digital interactions and measurements. And I think a really interesting thing about value-based care, once again in general, is it takes things that are, whether you're a payer or a provider organization, not necessarily an individual doctor, certainly if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, it takes what used to be an epidemiological equation in terms of how effective you are being, and you kind of realign yourself directly to individuals. Right? In a value-based environment, it's more important for me not to give somebody the wrong therapy than it is in the case where I'm just trying to get as many people as I possibly can to get the right therapy. And so I think that that's actually a great kind of touchstone for making sure that we do keep the patient in the center of this. Am I generating measurably valuable outcomes to individuals, and is my business model, is the regulatory environment actually rewarding that versus rewarding more of a population-based outcome, which is I see as kind of the old school of medicine.
I couldn't agree more. I think it is a struggle, ironically. In the busy provider space, the focus is on outcomes, but there's also concern about efficiency and bringing down cost. And it's hard to remember that you have to keep the patient at the center. But I think that's one of the things that's very exciting about some of the new digital solutions that are out there. Again, getting back to telehealth and telemedicine, if you can provide your patient with a virtual visit rather than requiring them to come in person, you're actually improving access and improving patient convenience. When I was at Boston Children's Hospital, we built a teleconcussion program where the patients still came in when they had that first concussion to be diagnosed. But we built a program where for that 6-week visit, when they were supposed to come back to the hospital to get checked to make sure they were okay, we allowed them to do that virtually, where we created the possibility of having that visit at home. And basically, the patients and the parents love this because it's really inconvenient to drive into a busy medical center, to park, to wait in the waiting room, and then to have your visit and maybe your appointment's on time, but maybe it's a little bit late or a lot late. Very frustrating and not very, considerate of the patient. So now being able to do a virtual visit from the comfort of your own home with your doctor really put patients at the center. It made them feel like we as a hospital cared about their experience. And interestingly, we actually started this program not just because we wanted to improve the patient experience, but because we actually wanted to improve the outcomes from the concussion clinic. Because what was happening was a lot of these patients were not coming back for that 6-week visit because they felt okay and it was really inconvenient. And so they were often going back into sports or school before it was safe for them. But once we made the visit really easy by doing it virtually, they were all coming and getting that checkup. And so we were hoping and had better quality outcomes because patients were actually being told whether it was safe or not, and they weren't just making those decisions for themselves. So I think that it's really important to keep the patient experience front and center, but outcomes also can benefit, and there's a lot that can be done with digital therapies.
No, I was going to agree with that completely. I mean, one thing we say is you will drive 3.5 hours to go get a knee surgery. You're not going to do it once a week for 16 weeks for a behavior change program, right? So if we can lower the barriers to access for folks who live in rural areas, for folks who are seniors and maybe have mobility issues, for folks who are low income and may not have the work flexibility to make an appointment once a week, every week for 16 weeks, you really lower barriers to access in ways that can, I mean, drive better engagement and drive better outcomes. So I think that's right on.
I would add that I think that in the future, the patient and their home will be not just the center of attention, but the center of care and the point of care. This is expanding on what you were saying, Naomi, that I think the meta trend right here is not to have the hospital, not to have the clinic be where the transaction happens, but to be the home, especially with an aging population who don't want to move into skilled nursing facilities and senior care facilities. I think, I'm not sure what year to say, but at some point, medicine will be at the patient, at the home, and not anyplace else.
And we'll have digital thank for that.
Absolutely.
100%, and I think that it's an important and quite literal thing to recognize, right? That digital medicine breaks the necessary physical rule that we had to put a person in front of a healthcare provider
Right.
to estimate the impact of care to date and to provide further care. And so not only can we not transport the patient maybe once a week for 16 weeks, but maybe that's not the right schedule, and we can actually titrate their care in a way where we have the right frequency of interactions, whether digital or live, and that can drive some good economic outcomes.
And it could even be more frequency now because it's virtual,
Yeah.
which could be better care.
Exactly.
Well, and for the times that the patient comes into the provider's office, for that provider to be properly equipped with all the information that's been
Yes.
accumulated between visits so that that can be a really efficient and really effective visit for not just the patient, but also for the provider and that provider's level of education.
And we're seeing this, especially in Glen, I know you in particular are overseas, probably more than you're here in the country. But we're seeing this in a lot of, especially developing countries where I work. And it's because that four-walled institution system that we have never made it. And so it's a natural way of thinking for so many other cultures, as opposed to this, I'm going to drive to this place and park and wait. And that's really us, and that's our problem.
And our doctors.
And we're really having to break out of this, and it's proved to be very difficult for us to change. But I think really the implications around the world are just phenomenal. And I actually want to ask for very, like a grounded example. And Walter, I'm looking at you. Unfortunately, I just had my first virtual reality experience on stage in front of hundreds of people.
I'm so sorry.
The floor dropped out from under me by 6 floors. I learned I have a fear of heights. Didn't know that. It was embarrassing. But so give us an example of something that, is improving adherence, or something that you're seeing using that virtual technology or that AI.
The reason they made you step over that plank or whatever you did was to show that we can evoke a cognitive state
Yes.
using virtual
Exactly.
environments. So that's the premise of most aspects of behavioral change. In order to change a thought process, a cognitive process, you have to be able to evoke a cognitive process. I'm sorry they put you through that.
And my background also is in neuro.
Yeah.
My doctorate's in policy, my background's in, and so I knew what was happening, and it made it even harder because my brain was fighting my brain.
We find in our lab that almost 20% of the people, even though they're talking to other people in the room, can't step off that ledge because it's so profound. I should say that there's probably $60 billion being spent over the next few years on moving this enabling technology that you just described out into the enterprise and out into the home. So it's something we will leverage as we do healthcare. And it's going to make a big difference in terms of telemedicine, as we just talked about. And it's a very, we can address anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, autism, Asperger's, cognitive aging. There's so many issues that we've had very few tools to address. And pharma, in particular, has hit the wall when it comes to CNS in many ways. And this is a new enabling technology that can be used synergistically with pharmaceutical preparations, too. It doesn't have to be used separately. I think it's going to change things quite dramatically. But your example of how virtual reality technology can evoke a cognitive state gives us the tools, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the behavioral change agents, to really reach out and change adherence, change behavior, change mood. And I'm very excited about it.
And so going with behavior, I'm going to go a different direction with that. And in the calls with each of you leading up to this, I asked what I thought was kind of a scary question. But I said, do you want to talk about the future and policy and health policy? And you're all very brave, and you said yes. But Adam, I'm going to start with you. I think you have a very strong background in this and are able to speak to a lot of the change that's in front of us. And the best any of us can do right now is guess. And anyone who says they know what's going to happen is lying to you. Don't believe them. When thinking about behavior on Capitol Hill and how we're going to start, the Cures Act just passed, the Vice President spoke last night, we know we have cancer moonshot, precision medicine. All these things have intertwined policy, technology, and healthcare in a way that can't be undone. So over the next couple of years, what do you anticipate as being those big drivers from DC and or at the state level that trickle into digital medicine?
That's such a good question. And yeah, I'm going to stay away from trying to analyze mental states and behavioral states on Capitol Hill because that's a dark, deep path I'm not prepared to go down.
I know. I like when I get out and come to this coast.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a couple things, and there was a great series of New York Times articles last week on this about sort of where healthcare reform has gone to date and where we may expect it to continue. And I use healthcare reform in its broadest sense. I'm not just talking about the ACA, but as you said, cures, a lot of the work that's been done on precision medicine. So I think if you look at those, what's happened in the last, say, 8 to 10 years, you can very crudely put it into two buckets. One is sort of coverage expansion activity, and the other is sort of delivery transformation, how medicine is delivered, how it's paid for. I think if you put the first bucket of coverage expansion aside, because I think that is really the height of the uncertainty right now, but what I'm hearing from most policymakers, and not just policymakers, but also those in the private sector who have reacted to these policy changes and aren't particularly eager to turn back the clock because they've put all this time and effort and resources into changing, is that the practice delivery pressures to pay more for value and less for volume have sort of, the ball is already rolling down the hill and it's not going to stop. So I think what you're going to see on the federal level and on the state level, especially in some of the public payer systems, is that continued pressure to deliver quality of care but also deliver value is only going to accelerate. I'm trying to remember the exact statistic. Every day, I believe it's something about 65,000 Americans age into Medicare. Right now, if diabetes care alone continues at the same rate as it did over the last 15 years, by 2029, we will spend just enough paying for diabetes care as the entire Medicare budget. It is the numbers simply are not sustainable. So the fact that we are going to try to deliver interventions, deliver therapeutics, whether they're digital or not, that reduce disease risk, that bring value to the system, to me, that is the one thing I would, and I'm not going to predict, I'm not going to say no, what's going to happen, but if I had a crystal ball, that's what I would bet on, is that those types of intervention, those types of reforms are going to continue. I don't know exactly in what form yet.
So I'll speak about the FDA, which I think is the most likely steady as it goes from the perspective of how you approve a new drug or device. And I expect in that context, because in many cases, I know a lot of these people, these are our clients, it's more the life sciences industry that's reticent to go to the FDA with solutions that include digital medical components, but I think the agency's quite ready, willing, and able to evaluate them. And I think as soon as we start to see drugs, devices being approved that include, to Walter's point, components of digital medicine, the life sciences industry is a industry in the most literal sense that has the money to pay for developing interesting digital medicine solutions and will benefit from going to market with them. So I think it can be a tremendous driver, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, at least in this case, it's probably the policymakers, at least from the FDA perspective, don't need to change what they're doing. We're probably well served by the way they're operating now.
So I want to sort of pick up on Glen's thoughts about the FDA, because as a digital health strategist working with digital solutions that have clinical impact, there's a lot of questions about, well, where's the FDA going to come out on this? And, you know, for many years, we were all sort of watching and waiting. How are they going to handle sort of the new clinical apps that are being developed and the software programs that we want to use that we think are actually clinical grade? And so I think that, you know, the FDA took its time, and where it's come out so far in terms of the balance between sort of safety and innovation is pretty good. What we're seeing now for at least a lot of apps and solutions is they're sort of looking at 3 buckets. They'll say, you know, there's some things that we do not need to regulate. So these are the health and fitness apps, you know, sort of basic, simple content, and that's sort of intuitive. That makes sense. They've said there's other things that clearly they want to regulate. So if you're building an app or a solution that's going to determine how much drug a patient gets or advise a doctor on how to titrate medication, they want to regulate it. They want to make sure it works. They want to make sure it's safe. And then they've created this sort of in-between category called enforcement discretion, which is interesting. And that's sort of we'll watch and wait, and we'll look at it on a case-by-case basis and figure out exactly how much risk there is to patients and what the impact's going to be. And I think this sort of 3-tiered approach is actually very good for the industry because it helps us sort of segment, getting back to the toys versus tools concept, and recognizing, you know, what's in what category, and also recognizing that we're bringing forth new solutions that are sort of in that middle category and should be thought of carefully. And so I think that the FDA is going down a good path. I think it's going to be really important for the high-impact digital solutions, the digital therapies and other clinical tools to actually have FDA backing, because I think that gets the attention of the payers when you can say, you know what, the FDA said this worked. That's a really important stamp. Or the FDA says, I have approval to, you know, distribute this in the market. I think that really sets a new bar for how those treatments should be addressed. And I think it's a great differentiator, again, from the tools and for the tools and the toys.
Thank you. And I like that you talked about that gray area. It's where all the regulatory attorneys are
and the fun.
Making all their money. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm going to ask one more sort of broad question to each of you. And something I learned in the process of getting to know all these people is that all of us are entrepreneurs. And in the real sense of the word. We've all started our own things. And so I want to end on a positive note before we throw it out for questions. So Walter, I'll start with you down there at the end. What are you most looking forward to? And I'd like you to wear not only your entrepreneur hat, but as you frame it, you know, around digital medicine, what is it that has you so excited about the future that you come here and you want to talk to all these people and spend your days, you know, having these discussions? What is it that really does it for you?
Well, everybody in this room can probably guess by now. I'm very passionate about the revolution in technology that's happening that I think will, and with interactive, immersive technology, both AR and VR, is going to make a big difference in our life, and I think it's going to profoundly change how we deliver medicine. So I'm passionate about that. What worries me, though, is there's a bonfire going on, or a forest fire might be a better analogy, which is neurodegenerative disease and aging. As the boomers go in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, 2 out of every 7 of us will have a neurodegenerative disease, and we don't have very effective tools for that. So I'm passionate about how emerging technology can make a big difference. I think we're all going to have a lot of fun seeing what happens, and it's going to be very profound, and there's going to be a lot of very exciting startups and entrepreneurs out there. But meanwhile, I think there's some healthcare crises, and I just named one, and there's others that I think need our urgent attention. So I'm passionate and excited about the new tools that we're going to have, but I'm also worried about the problems we're going to have.
So I am really excited and passionate about the digital medicine revolution that's underway. I think this is a paradigm shift in healthcare. But I also recognize with any really disruptive innovation, with any paradigm shift, there's a need for a new ecosystem, for new partnerships, for new ways of doing business. And so where I think a lot of energy needs to go, and I'm certainly working, is trying to build a new ecosystem. And I think that is in many ways, very well done by partnerships between pharma and startups. I think that pharma are not the right group to build digital solutions or create digital therapies. It just doesn't work with their business models. I think these digital solutions should come out of the startups. They're nimble, they're fast, they're tech savvy. They think about users when they're designing these solutions. But I think that the startups, are not good at getting these solutions out to market. I think it's a complex environment. It's hard to sell to the variety of physician groups that are out there. It's hard to work with all the different procurement processes that hospitals have. But that's where pharma really has a lot of strength. And so I'm excited to see startups partner with pharma, because I think pharma can create and open their sales channels, their marketing expertise to these digital medicine startups. I think pharma also can teach startups about how to navigate the regulatory world, about how to get reimbursement and CPT codes. So I am very excited to help build this new ecosystem where we have a new type of partnership between digital health startups and traditional pharma, because I think both of them bring some very important tools, and together they could have a very synergistic relationship.
The continuous quantitative measurement simultaneously of physiology and behavior and cognition, I think, will lead to a complete reset in the way we think about value in healthcare. The importance of quality of life will take the pole position ahead of measurements like overall survival, and I think that means we're all going to live better, healthier, happier lives. And even if we couldn't see when the digital happened, because of the digital technologies themselves, you'd notice it in the healthcare world and economy as people start to value quality of life, and I'm super excited about that.
And for me, to paraphrase kind of a well-worn saying, I think necessity is going to be the mother of innovation here. There is a need for doing things differently, and I think we're just in the midst of, or at the early stages of, a revolution where we really get to set the terms of the debate a little bit in this industry and sort of lay out what it takes to be a good actor and be taken seriously by the incumbents. And I think this is a year that's really going to accelerate, and I think that's really exciting.
I love that. And I wasn't intending to answer my own question, but I'm going to, based on all of and it worked perfectly as you came back this way, because I really believe in the technology and the partnerships are what have me excited, because, briefly putting on my communications hat as a writer, and this is how I know some of you, I get to tell the stories. And the ability of whether it's partnerships and pharma now talking to someone else, or the private, the public, they're all coming together, the layperson, and that ability to educate and communicate about what we're doing and who we are, unlimited potential. I'm very excited. So with that, we will take questions. I see someone in the back has a microphone, so if you have a question, just raise your hand, stand up. And if not, I will certainly keep asking questions back there.
Hi. There's been a lot of discussion that the Trump administration would relax rules on the territory in which health insurers can operate in. I think he so famously was quoted as saying, take away the boxes, right? Take away the boxes around the states. If that were the case and any health insurer could sell a health plan in any other part of the country, do you see that as an opening for telehealth networks insofar as those, let's say, out-of-state or out-of-area health plans would not be capable of, at least immediately, building out an actual bricks-and-mortar health plan network?
So I think the issue is not for telehealth, the challenge is still the rules that states have about whether doctors can practice medicine in their state without licensure there. So I'm not sure that unboxing the payers and the health plans is going to get us across that problem. There is work being done right now across the country to try to get states to sign on to a compact to sort of agree that they will allow telehealth at least to be practiced across state lines. So I'm hoping that that will be successful. I hope eventually all the states will sign on. But we definitely still have a lot of work to do to get to the point where telemedicine flows as freely as electrons do across our country.
And the word she used, licensure, I think isn't addressed by unboxing, because states right now are so independent. And then you look at even everything from an MD to a PA to NP. Each state is different, and there's a whole logistic nightmare in there of unboxing. We're so quiet. Does everyone have coffee? Do you need coffee?
I have a question for the audience. What are you passionate about? I'd love to hear from you what you're most excited about.
You can just shout it out. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested in what's going on with telemedicine now, what some of the next steps are, because we always had, there was always these talks of having the phone and talking to the doctor, and now they're integrated into EHRs, now they're integrated into medical devices. I'm wondering, what do you think about what's going on now, and what do you think needs coming up next?
Well, I think the potential for, as you said, telemedicine to move beyond simply the audio interaction or even a face-to-face sort of video interaction to actually, I think one of the things that took people a little while to get to is that digital doesn't just have to be a translation of what an in-person interaction can be. You can actually leverage the unique capabilities of the technology to make the interaction itself more effective. So I'm actually really interested to see where telemedicine is going to head in that direction, right? What can we use with recognition technology or looking at how folks, pixels dilate while they're talking to their doctor in a telemedicine interaction to actually start to get some insights about the patient and equip the provider with real-time information that he or she can use either in that individual interaction or following up on it. So that's what I think is going to be really interesting in telemedicine.
So just to give you my opinion also on telemedicine, because I do think about this a lot, and I think it's really exciting. So on the patient front, I think we're going to see more than just face-to-face virtual visits. I think we're going to start adding tools in the home that help the clinician get more information, whether that's a digital thermometer that can send information back to the doctor in real time, something that can look in a baby's ear or down the throat, that basically enhances the flow of information and allows the physician to make a higher quality clinical interpretation during that visit. I think in terms of the patient, eventually we're going to get to virtual robotic surgery, where the doctor will be operating on the patient, but maybe the patient won't be in the same room, they'll be in a different country. And I think you can think about how exciting that is for access to care when you start to be able to couple patients that maybe don't have access to very skilled clinicians with those clinicians living in another part of the world. And then I think the other area we're going to see growth in the telemedicine industry is the clinician-to-clinician virtual consultation. So being able to have your expert or specialist consult with a doctor someplace else. Right now this happens sort of impromptu. There may be curbside consultations. Doctors may call other doctors, but I think we're going to create more formalized networks where experts that are often at academic medical centers can consult with clinicians in the community or hopefully eventually in other states. When I was at Boston Children's Hospital, we began to put in place a program like this where our critical care doctors could advise physicians in community hospitals when a child that was critically ill came in there. The community hospital could turn on a system where the doctor could visualize the patient, talk with the doctors, see all of the medical information coming off of the devices as well as the medical record, and make real-time provide real-time guidance to clinicians. So I think we're going to see a lot more care and expertise and information flowing virtually.
I think it's worth putting an exclamation point on something Naomi said. The world of telemedicine and instrumentation will mean that what happens now, which is your health state is defined at the instantaneous moment of the encounter, will no longer be the case. Your health state will be defined by continuous feeds of physiological and behavioral information that extend far before and far after the encounter. I don't think that encounter goes away, but that's the time that you're going to interact with your physician based on that health state that's much more sophisticated in its definition.
What Naomi and Glen said, I think that what I'm excited about is when you have conditions that affect multiple systems, and then you have doctors that need to consult various specialists, and that's going to improve not only quality of life of patients, but just the standard of care.
And right over here.
I have a lot of excitement right now around behavioral medicine and just behavioral health issues that I know we didn't talk too much about today. Walter did a little bit. But in our field where we've had over 50 years of the same workforce shortages that really aren't making we're not making a dent in them. And we also have a distribution and networking problem in our field. And I think just even outside of the clinical application, just the ability to increase access to other ways of supporting and helping in the treatment realm will be novel for our field for sure. I know that we have one way usually of having people get care, and that's either seek care at a therapist office or go to the ER. There are a number of other solutions along that trajectory that we can impact through digital health.
Thank you. So there's one more, and then we are going to wrap up.
I'm back to asking you a question. I was just wondering, maybe for Naomi, you said that one of the most exciting things that you're seeing are pharma and startup partnerships. Could you say a little bit more about what are some exciting things that you're seeing in those partnerships? What are the trends?
So I would say it's very early on. I think there is a lot of potential. It's hard for pharma to sort of move out of their comfort zone and recognize that there's some brilliant things happening outside of their organization. One company that's presenting a little later today is Gaia. They are digital therapy they have a digital therapy for depression as well as for fatigue, and they've recently been talking to pharma about how they might bundle their solution with drugs, how the drug and digital solution, I think, is what is really exciting. And I think pharma needs to recognize that with digital health, they have the opportunity to open up new business models. They have a way to differentiate themselves, and that it actually can help their bottom line. I personally believe that pharma that don't move into the digital space are going to get left behind. I don't think it's optional, but I think I'm an early voice in this conversation. There are some pharmaceutical companies that are starting to think about a digital therapy strategy, but I don't think they're all fully engaged. I like to think that they're sort of flirting with startups right now and flirting with the idea, and I got news for them. They need to get married.
They're at least speed dating.
Yeah.
I don't think it's so fast.
Yeah.
We got to start with dates.
Well, and I think, we were really lucky. We recently brought on the former CMO of Sanofi as our CMO, and he said something really fascinating in an interview right before the holidays, which is he believes that there is a future coming, and it's not too far off, that pharmaceutical companies will not, or providers will not prescribe a pharmaceutical intervention without prescribing an accompanying therapeutic intervention, and whether that is for behavioral health, whether it's for a behavior-driven chronic disease. I think that is a really exciting future too. I don't know if it's happening this year, but I can't wait for it to happen.
And it's just from the perspective of at least the clinical development programs. As actually going back to my introduction, one of the fastest growing things that we're at least seeing at Medidata, and we do a lot of clinical trials around the world, is people incorporating digital technology. So I think that's the leading indicator that we are going to get there. And I think we are at that inflection point where pharma is catching on that this is essential.
Excellent. With that, I'd like to say thank you to all of the panelists. We will all be around, so find us throughout the day and ask more questions.